You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Stephen Barr. He's a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Delaware and a member of its Bartol Research Institute. He does research in theoretical particle physics and cosmology. Since 2000, Dr. Barr has served on the editorial advisory board, now the advisory council, of the religious intellectual journal called First Things. In 2007, he was awarded the Bene Merenti Medal by Pope Benedict XVI. In 2010, Dr. Barr was elected a member of the Academy of Catholic Theology. He is the author of Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, A Student's Guide to Natural Science. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming Dr. Stephen Barr.
In the last 20 or 30 years, physicists have increasingly come to realize many features of the universe, many features of the laws of physics and of the structure of the physical universe are conducive to the possibility of life arising in it and or being able to exist in it. And some people call these anthropic coincidences. Now, some of these are fine-tunings, but not all of them are fine-tunings. Some of these features are gross qualitative features of the universe. For example, the very fact that the laws of nature are quantum mechanical is actually very good, a very good feature. It contributes to the possibility that the universe is able to have life. It's a very fortunate thing that the universe is quantum mechanical, as opposed to being classical in the physics terminology. Other gross qualitative features are the fact that there's such a thing as electromagnetism. There are four known basic forces of nature: electromagnetism, the weak force, the strong force, gravitation. There may be others. If there were no such thing as if the laws of physics were otherwise the same as they are, but say you did away with electromagnetism, and actually you can do that mathematically. If you imagine the universe not having electromagnetism, then the prospects of life would be probably virtually nil. Or if there weren't such a force as gravity. Now, so there are gross qualitative, certain kinds of particles are needed. If the laws of physics are as we know them, but there were no such particles as electrons, for example, then the prospects for life would be very dim indeed. Other anthropic features of the universe are quantitative. For example, the number of space dimensions, the number of large space dimensions in which macroscopic objects can move around. It's 3. And there are arguments to the effect that if there were more than 3 large dimensions or fewer than 3, the prospects for life would be crippled, severely, much smaller, and maybe non-existent. But there are also certain parameters in the laws of physics that seem to have to take very certain values to great accuracy. They have to be fine-tuned to special values to make life possible. And a good example of this that I discuss in my book is a certain parameter in our current theory of physics, which is symbolized by the letter V, and which is called, in the technical jargon, the Higgs vacuum expectation value. Now, this parameter V, it turns out, as far as the mathematics of our theory is concerned, could take any value in a huge range, and the mathematics of our theory would be okay. There's nothing. The theory would be mathematically self-consistent and so on. But unless that parameter has a value in a very narrow range, the universe almost certainly would not have to have life in it. And so it seems that that parameter, prima facie, it seems that that parameter has been fine-tuned by somebody to be in just the right range to make life possible. So those are the kinds of things people talk about as anthropic coincidences or anthropic features of the universe and its laws. Now, at first glance, you can say, well, that's a slam dunk argument for the existence of God. If you have all these different features of the laws of nature, they have to be just so to make life possible, including certain parameters that have to be very, very accurately fine-tuned. That suggests that somebody sort of jury-rigged the universe to make life possible, that there was a mind that had the intention of making our universe habitable and chose these features to be what they are. And I think that's a perfectly respectable point of view, and I think it might be right, but we have to be careful, because there's another way of explaining at least some of these features, and that is the multiverse idea. And I won't go through the argument, because I'm sure everybody here are familiar with how a multiverse might explain some of these coincidences or these features. Now, in reading the students' comments, there are a number of misconceptions that I think I'd like to clear up. And then when we get to the sort of Q&A session, we can talk more about other things you want to hear. So there are 4 misconceptions that struck me. Let me get to the students' comments on my computer so I can quote from them if necessary. One comment is that the multiverse idea somehow implies that the universe has no beginning. And so, for example, so one student said, it is merely a way out of a basic trap, having to admit that there might actually be a beginning to the universe we live in. And another student said something similar. The whole idea is really a stretch to avoid the possibility of our universe having a beginning. So that's one misconception. The multiverse idea is not necessarily tied to the idea that the universe has no beginning. In fact, I think there's actually not really a logical connection between the idea of a multiverse and the idea of the universe having no beginning. In the most reasonable multiverse scenarios, the universe did have a beginning. Okay, so let me that's a red herring. Let's forget about the question of a beginning. Even in the most reasonable multiverse scenarios, the universe had a beginning. Okay, the second misconception about the multiverse is that somehow it involves there being a large number or an infinite number of disconnected universes that have nothing whatsoever to do with each other. And so one student said, because each universe is a separate entity, they are all unconnected, and put unconnected all in capital letters. That's not true. I would say that in the most conservative, reasonable multiverse scenario, there aren't disconnected universes that have nothing to do with each other. Really, what there are in the most sensible scenario is one universe, one connected universe in which there are many regions. So we might say many domains or regions within the universe, but all those regions are connected up with each other. They're all part of one universe. So the multiverse is really one in the most conservative versions of the idea. There's just one universe with many sub-universes, domains, regions, whatever you want to call them. Okay. Okay, a second misconception, I think it's a misconception, is that the idea is simply so absurd on the face of it, so ridiculous that we can simply laugh at it and call it a day. It's not even worth considering. And a number of students said that it is just an absurdity. The third and I'll explain why I think that's not true. The third thing is that it is a misconception is that the whole multiverse idea is a desperate ploy or a desperate stratagem by atheists to avoid the obvious conclusion from various physical facts that there's a God. So atheists invented the idea just to avoid believing in God, and this is simply not the case. And the fourth misconception, I think it's a misconception, is that because the multiverse idea is probably not testable empirically, that we don't have to take it seriously. Okay, so let me go through these four misconceptions one at a time. Let's start with the idea of the multiverse. Well, as I said, there are many versions of the multiverse. One thing people have to understand is that there are many speculative ideas, many speculative theories in current cosmology. And And so, there are many speculative. The multiverse is one such speculative idea, and in fact, the multiverse idea comes in a variety of versions. There are versions of the multiverse idea where the universe has no beginning, and there are versions where there are disconnected universes. The version of the multiverse idea that is the most conservative, the most plausible, the one that most physicists would take, the physicists would take most seriously, is the following. It's the idea that the universe is extremely large, much larger than the part that we can see with telescopes. The part that we can see with telescopes, the part that we can actually observe, is called the observable universe. It is the part that lies within what's called our horizon. And our horizon only extends out so far. The reason the horizon only extends so far is that information can only travel at the speed of light or slower. And so this part of the universe, light can only have traveled about 14 billion light years since the Big Bang. And so anything that's farther away from us than 14 billion light years, something that's 20 billion light years or 100 billion light years away, we won't see it because light hasn't had time to get to us from those remote areas. Of course, if we lived another 80 billion years, then the light would get to us, but we're not going to live another 80 billion years. So there are parts of the universe, so we can only see a certain distance out, our horizon. And so the idea is the universe may be vastly bigger than what we can see, than the observable universe. And the idea then is that in regions very far outside our horizon, conditions may be very different than they are here, and so different that in fact it superficially looks like there are different laws of physics. There could be different forces there than here. Maybe in the distant regions there are no electrons, but some other kinds of particles. There may not be electromagnetism, but different forces. And so the Higgs vacuum expectation value, this parameter V, might take different values, and so on. Now, another thing that people should be aware of is that most physicists believe, including myself, that the entire universe, the entire multiverse, if we are in a multiverse, really deep down at the most basic level, has the same underlying laws of physics, that there are some fundamental set of laws of physics that apply everywhere throughout the universe. But these laws of physics can manifest themselves in different ways in different places. So to take an analogy, ice, if somebody who didn't know anything about ice and water, maybe someone who, caveman who had never seen ice before, if you showed him ice and water, he would think they were two completely different things. Deep down, and that they even obeyed different laws. But deep down, we know they're both H2O, but different phases of H2O. So H2O can manifest itself as ice, which has certain properties, or as water, which has other properties. In the same way, the same underlying laws of physics in different places in the universe can be in different phases. And in one phase, you can have certain kinds of particles and forces and parameters can have certain values, whereas in other regions there can be different things. Okay, all governed, however, deep down by the same fundamental laws. Now, that's kind of the. Now, is that absurd to imagine that that's the case? Not at all from the point of view of fundamental physics. It may be absurd to the man on the street, but the man on the street doesn't know a lot about fundamental physics, and so he's not in a position to judge what ideas make sense from the point of view of what we know about physics today, and what ideas don't make much sense. The multiverse idea makes a lot of sense. To somebody who knows a lot of fundamental physics, a particle physicist, for example, it is not a far-fetched idea in the version that I just explained, where the universe is very big and the laws of physics manifest themselves differently in different places. Why do I say it's not absurd? It's not absurd because, first of all, we don't know, but there's very strong reasons to believe that the universe is much, much larger than the part that we can see and that is within our horizon. Of course, we can't directly verify that by definition, because parts of the universe outside our horizon we can't see. So we can't ever say, yes, there's so much universe out there beyond our horizon. We'll never be able to show that directly or empirically. But there are strong reasons to believe that the universe is vastly larger than our horizon. Indirect theoretical reasons to believe that. They have to do with an idea called inflation. There are strong theoretical reasons to believe that early in the universe very rapidly swelled to an enormous factor times. It expanded very rapidly in a very short time. And in these inflationary theories, it is most likely that the universe is vastly bigger than the part we can see. So that one condition for having a multiverse is satisfied. What about the idea that the laws of physics would be different in remote areas of the universe? That also is quite plausible. What you need for that to happen is your theory, your fundamental theory has to have a multiplicity of what are called ground states. If you will, the equations of the fundamental laws must have a variety of different solutions to the equations that are equally good. And many of the theories that we study today that are very well motivated from an empirical point of view actually have the property that the theory has multiple ground states. Now, if a theory has multiple ground states, then and the universe is very, very big, then what's going to happen, inevitably, is that in one part of the universe, things are going to kind of fall into one of the ground states, whereas in a different part of the universe, they'll fall into a different ground state, and different regions will take it. The equations will be solved differently in different places. So we already know the universe. There's strong reason to believe the universe is very big. There's strong reasons to believe that the universe might have a multiplicity of ground states. Those are the two key ingredients you need to have some kind of a multiverse. So the multiverse idea is not far-fetched from a physics point of view. Now, that doesn't mean that the multiverse, if we are in a multiverse, that it necessarily is the kind of multiverse that will explain all of these anthropic coincidences or features of the universe. That doesn't follow at all. So, for example, this parameter V that I mentioned has to be have a very special value if life is to arise. Well, you could imagine a multiverse where the parameter V took different values in different places. But that doesn't necessarily follow from the idea of a multiverse. You could have that is, in a multiverse, some features of the universe vary from one region to another. That doesn't mean all of them vary from one region to another. It's quite possible that the parameter V varies from one region to another, but maybe, the fact that there's an electromagnetic force does not vary from place to place. So some things might vary from place to place and not others. If you're going to explain all the anthropic coincidences, you have to have almost all of the features of the laws of physics vary from one region to another. And that's a very tall order. That's not just saying you have a multiverse. It's saying you have a multiverse of a very specific kind, one in which is an enormous, shall we say, very multifarious. It's one in which almost all possibilities are realized somewhere. That doesn't have to be the case just because you have a multiverse. Okay, so we have to be aware of that. A multiverse could be a kind of a relatively threadbare multiverse in which only a few things change from place to place, or it could be a very variegated multiverse in which almost everything changes from place to place. And that makes a difference if you're trying to explain various features of the laws of physics this way. Is it a desperate ploy by atheists? No, it is not. Actually, I think based on my own experience and what I've seen and heard, I think it's fair to say if you were to take a poll among people in fundamental physics, by which I mean particle physics primarily, if you were to take a poll among just the atheists who are particle physicists, I think you would find the overwhelming majority of them despise the multiverse idea. On the other hand, some atheists are very enamored of the idea, okay? Especially some of the smarter atheists, like Steven Weinberg, because they're intelligent enough to realize that the multiverse does allow atheists to an escape hatch from certain kinds of arguments for the existence of God. Okay, but this is not the prevailing view among most atheists in my field. On the contrary, as I say, most of them despise the idea. Why? Partly they despise it because the multiverse is not testable, almost certainly not testable, and so they would say it's not science. And okay. So, on the other hand, there are religious scientists, good Christians, Catholics and Protestants, in my field of physics, who think the multiverse idea is quite interesting and plausible and has a good possibility of being right. I'm one of them. And I am an Orthodox Catholic. Don Page is another one. He's a well-known cosmologist who's an evangelical Christian. So these attitudes towards the multiverse idea cut across religious, philosophical, political lines. It's not that atheists believe in the multiverse and believers, religious people, don't. That's actually not even an approximation to the situation. That's not at all the way things are. Furthermore, it wasn't just invented to get out of arguments for the existence of God. As I tried to make clear, there are physics reasons to think we might live in a multiverse, to suspect that we might. There are, in fact, the reason why more physicists take the multiverse idea seriously now than they did, say, 10 or 15 years ago. 15 years ago, it was almost impossible to get a paper published in a physics journal about the multiverse idea. I know that because I've written a paper that's one of the most cited papers on the multiverse idea, and I almost couldn't get it published 15 years ago. Now, such papers are easy to get published because attitudes have changed. Why? Not because people are getting more or less atheist. It's because certain developments within physics make the multiverse idea more plausible than it seemed 15 years ago. One of the biggest things is the development of superstring theory. About 10 or 15 years ago, actually maybe more, people began to realize that superstring theory seems very likely to predict that the universe is a multiverse. Now people might say, well, the superstring theory is not testable either. Maybe so. It's actually quite possible that we will never be able to test superstring theory. Nevertheless, there are very strong reasons to believe that superstring theory could be the ultimate theory of physics. Very strong theoretical reasons to think the superstring theory is right. Now, that gets me to my final point. What about the idea that the multiverse is not testable? I say that's almost certainly the case, by definition. We can see every part of the universe that we can see, there are strong indications that the laws of physics are the same as they are here on Earth. Okay? So how could you ever test what's happening in parts of the universe that are too far away to see? You can't, by definition. Now, some of the students took that, said, okay, this is therefore a ridiculous, idea we don't have to take seriously. It's untestable. I disapprove of this attitude, actually. And I think what it is, it's thinking like atheists think. Atheists, many of them have mock or dismiss belief in God on the grounds that you can't go to the laboratory and do an experiment to prove the existence of God. You can't see God with a telescope or a microscope or a particle accelerator or do a chemical experiment and have God show up in it. So they say, well, God is untestable scientifically, therefore it's absurd to believe in God. Now, it's very tempting to turn the weapons of one's enemies on them and to say, okay, you guys, you atheists, think it's absurd to believe in entities that you can't verify experimentally, whose existence you can't verify. Well, some of you atheists, like Steven Weinberg and Richard Dawkins and so on, babble on about the multiverse, and that's not testable experimentally. So you guys are being inconsistent. Okay, if you're just trying to prove that the atheists are being inconsistent by taking multiverses seriously but not taking God seriously, fine. That's a reasonable line of argument. But it's one thing to take the premises of one's opponents and show that the premises lead to conclusions harmful to them, that is, to turn their own premises against them. It's another thing to accept their premises. And I don't think a religious person wants to accept the idea that it's absurd to believe or to entertain the possibility of certain things existing that can't be tested experimentally. Does a Christian really want to say that? Does a Catholic want to say that? That we should dismiss ideas out of hand because we can't test them experimentally? First of all, that would be fatal to belief in God. And secondly, there are lots of things that everybody believes, including scientists and non-scientists, that cannot be tested experimentally. And I could give examples later. But so the premise is just false. But there's more to say about it. There's another reason why we shouldn't just simply laugh at the multiverse idea and say, well, it's not testable, therefore we can dismiss it. Because it's ignoring where the burden of proof lies here. What is the multiverse being used to counter by people like Dawkins? The initial argument is that there is a God, that we have evidence of the existence of God from the existence of all of these anthropic features of the universe. That is, many religious people say, look, the laws of nature and the structure of the universe is fine-tuned, is just right to make life possible. And that's strong evidence that there's a God. Okay? So that's the argument being made by religious people, including myself in my book, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. It is perfectly reasonable for the atheists to come back and say, yes, but I have an alternative way to explain these facts. And as long as I have a reasonable alternative way to explain these facts, I don't have to accept the conclusion of your argument. He doesn't have to prove that his alternative explanation is right. He doesn't have to give evidence for it. He just has to show that there is an alternative way to explain the facts. Let me take an analogy. Suppose that I am on trial for murder. And suppose the prosecutor says, we have all this evidence, Exhibit A, B, C, D, E, that suggests that you, Stephen Barr, murdered somebody, murdered Mr. Joe Schmo. All I have to do to create reasonable doubt is to say, wait a minute, I have an alternative explanation of Exhibit A, B, C, and D. I have an alternative theory of the crime, that according to which I didn't do it, but somebody else did it. And I can give him my alternative. I don't have to prove that my alternative theory is right. I don't even have to have any evidence for it. As long as there's another plausible alternative explanation of the facts, you have to declare that the prosecutor's case has not been made. And if I have 5 alternative theories of the crime, then the prosecutor has failed to prove his case. And so if we think of the prosecutor here as being the religious person arguing for the existence of God from the anthropic features of the universe, it's perfectly reasonable for the atheists to come up with an alternative hypothesis, the multiverse, which explains the features he thinks just as well. And that's enough to show that the religious proof of the existence of God hasn't completely made its case. The atheist doesn't have to prove that the multiverse is there. He just has to prove that it's a plausible possibility. And so that's another reason I think this whole point that the multiverse is untestable is irrelevant, actually. Anyway, I'll stop there and maybe take questions, or go. Maybe I can expand on some of these points if people.
Well, I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
It's a good time to ask.
Fire away.
The first question I have is in regard to the theory that, in fact, the multiverse, or there are these different regions that are simply out of our range of perception.
Right.
Are there corresponding theories about what's happening at the boundaries between these regions?
Yes. As a matter of fact, there are. So now the regions, the boundaries presumably also are way outside our range of view, our horizon. Now, I'll take a simple example. There's a kind of theory that's called grand unified theories. And in fact, there's a kind of theory called supersymmetric grand unified theories. I've done some research in that area. They're, again, not proof. No one says that these theories have been confirmed by experiment because they haven't been, and they may never be. But there are hints. There are hints in the data that we know that suggest that maybe the laws of physics deep down are a supersymmetric grand unified theory. In the nickname for it is SUSY guts. SUSY meaning supersymmetry, guts meaning grand unified theory. Now, if the universe is a SUSY gut, and as I said, it's one of the more attractive possibilities theoretically, then there are several different ground states usually in the theory. Not a lot of them, just a few ground states. They're all equally good. And in such a theory, it is almost inevitable that one part of the universe falls into one ground state and the other parts fall into other ground states. If that's the case in this particular kind of theory, then between the two regions, there's what's called a domain wall. That is, if you somehow reach the boundary between the two regions, which would be put because the boundary has to be out. But if you could somehow reach it, what would happen is there would be a kind of a no man's land, DMZ, in which the fields of the theory would take. Well, what would happen is as the fields of the theory, as the variables of the theory, if you will, sort of make a transition from one ground state to the other, there's an enormous density of energy there. It would be, you've heard about neutron stars and things having terrific energy density. The energy density, or the mass of these walls per volume, is inconceivably greater than the most dense matter that we've ever encountered. So what would happen if somebody, if you ran your rocket ship into one of these things? Well, you'd be obliterated. It would be worse than hitting a steel wall. You would be absolutely... If anything came out the other side, it wouldn't even be the same kind of particles. It wouldn't just disintegrate you into your constituent electrons and protons and neutrons and things. If you got through the other side, instead of just sort of becoming part of the wall, you would actually come out as completely different kinds of particles in most cases. And so, but they're well-defined, precise mathematical descriptions. If you give me a specific theory with many ground states, I can sort of tell you what these domain walls are like.
So in that regard, I kind of suspected it might be something like that. My undergraduate study was in physics way long ago, but nowhere near the kind of realms that you are getting into. Is it then the theory that there really could be no information transmitted between these regions?
Well, as I say, the boundary between the regions would have to be, if there were a domain wall within our horizon, it would be blatantly obvious to us. We would know that already. So if there are other regions, the boundary between our kind of region and other kinds would be, the boundary itself is outside our horizon. We won't, so we'll not get into it. But if we happen to be, which we aren't, but if we happen to be near a domain wall, it's an interesting question. In principle, you could get information from the other side, but it would be pretty hard to decipher what that information was telling you, okay? I mean, I can get information from what's happening in the next room. If people are talking, I hear muffled voices. I get information. Knowing what they're saying, and knowing in detail what's going on in the other room from the little dribbles of information that come through the wall, that's another question. I think it would be very difficult to reconstruct very much about what was going on in the next domain just from what we could observe. But some kind of information would get through. As I say, it would be hard to interpret. One thing I want to make very clear, there's some anthropic coincidences or features that I don't think, this is important, I think, for the students in this class to realize. Some features of the universe that are conducive to life, that one could regard as anthropically fortunate, are not going to be explained by the multiverse. I'll take one really big example. I mentioned that the fact that the laws of physics are quantum mechanical. And I should emphasize, quantum mechanics is not a theory that applies here or there or to some phenomena and not others. It's an overarching framework in which all the laws of physics are within the framework of quantum mechanics and obey quantum mechanical principles. It didn't have to be that way. The universe could be non-quantum mechanical. In fact, until the 1920s, people thought it was. People hadn't even dreamt of quantum mechanics. A non-quantum mechanical world would be called a classical world. If the world were classical instead of quantum mechanical, there are reasons to believe that life might not be possible. Now you might say, well, could it be that in one region of the universe the laws are quantum mechanical, but in a distant region or domain they're non-quantum mechanical? One region's quantum mechanical, another region's not. It doesn't work that way. If quantum mechanics is true one place, it's true in the whole universe, everywhere. So the multiverse can't explain that. And I think there are certain other features of the universe that are conducive to life that the multiverse will not explain, could not explain. The other thing is, as I said, let's suppose there are 20 or 30 different anthropic features of the laws of physics. The number of space dimensions, the types of particles, the strength of the forces, the value of this Higgs vacuum excavation. Suppose you made a list of 30 of these features that have to be the way they are in order to have life possible. If the multiverse is to explain all of those 30 features, or even say 27 of them, you need to have a multiverse in which those 27 aspects of the laws vary from place to place in the universe. That is a tall order. That's a very tall order. If we could be living in a multiverse in which maybe 5 or 6 of those features vary from place to place, and maybe the multiverse idea explains 5 or 6 anthropic features of the universe. There still might leave 25 of them that it doesn't explain. So it's not either or. It's not like if we live in a multiverse that immediately gets rid of all these explains away all these anthropic coincidences. I think we probably live in a multiverse, and I think the multiverse probably explains a number of the features of the universe that are conducive to life. But I don't think it necessarily explains, I think it explains all of them. The other point to make is this, and this I think is the big point to make about all this. What we've learned in the last 20 or 30 years is that the laws of physics have to be special if you're going to have life. Not any old laws of physics that somebody could dream up in his study would lead to a universe that could have life in it. The laws of physics have to be special. That is not changed by the multiverse idea, because to have a multiverse itself requires that the laws of physics have to be special in certain ways. Not any laws of physics would lead to a multiverse. And so the laws of physics I think it's unquestionable that the laws of physics have to be special in one way or another if you're going to have life in the world. They could be special by having certain parameters of the laws of physics fine-tuned to certain values and so on. They could be special in being the kind of laws that give rise to a multiverse structure. Or they could be special in both ways. But one way or the other, they have to be special. And I think that's why I think the multiverse idea does not completely defeat the argument for God who designed the world and its laws to make life possible. Because in a sense, a multiverse the fact that the universe, if the universe is a multiverse, the fact that it is itself an anthropic coincidence. That's I think, the really central point. Anyway, I went on too long and went off on a tangent.
Sister Mary Helen, I've got a question.
Yeah. Okay.
You spoke about domain walls.
Yeah.
In a multiverse, could domain walls ever overlap, do you think? Is it possible that a being or an entity from a different multiverse, or from a different domain, a different universe, could ever find its way into ours?
Yeah.
Yeah, Dawkins says we don't know how life began, but we know it began somehow. Mm-hmm. And that's just a gap in the science, perhaps. Maybe we'll one day find out.
Right.
But could he ever hide behind the fact that it's possible that life began spontaneously in a domain in which spontaneous development of life could occur, and that it happened to fall or find its way into our universe where spontaneous development cannot occur?
No, that would be virtually. I mean, I think that would be virtually impossible. Let me say one thing. I do not like the idea of talking about this as a number of different universes. There are versions of the multiverse idea where there are different universes that sort of branch off from each other, for example. That, think of a balloon in which you have a balloon and then you pinch off another smaller balloon from it. So, maybe there are scenarios where the universe kind of splits into two universes that are disconnected from each other after they split. And so there are scenarios where there are different disconnected universes, but I think we shouldn't talk about that in the context of the multiverse because, as I said, the most conservative and the version of the multiverse idea which has the most going for it, so to speak, is the more conservative one in which there's just one universe all connected up, but with just different regions. And the way to think about that is just like maybe different rooms in a house. Is one big house, and I have this room, and there's a neighboring room, and we're divided by walls. But as I said, anything going through the wall would be worse than disintegrated. It would be completely, really kind of obliterated and turned into something. The energy that, if something impinged on the wall from one side, the energy in that thing could emerge on the other side. Some of it would be transmitted through the wall, but it would take a form that was utterly different from what hit the wall in the first place. And so it wouldn't be, if it was a living thing or an amino acid, forget it. It's just something.
So we're not talking about overlapping dimensions. We're talking about
dimensions. As I said, there are lots of speculative ideas in physics. There are different dimensions. It's very possible. In fact, I think there's strong reasons to believe there are other space dimensions, though they're very tiny, and so they're balled up into a subatomic size, so you can't move around in them. And there are theories with multiple universes splitting off from each other. There are scenarios with different numbers with extra space dimensions, as they're called, that are very small. I could go on for half an hour with all sorts of different speculative ideas, some of which are rather plausible, actually, from a theoretical point of view. But they shouldn't all be lumped together. They're distinct ideas. One or more of them may be correct. But you don't have to talk about them to talk about the multiverse idea. I think in talking about the multiverse idea, forget extra dimensions, forget universes that split apart, forget all that stuff. Just talk about a universe being big and having lots of regions that are far away from each other, where things are different. And I think if we stick to that, otherwise it ends up conflating all sorts of different speculations in a way that won't be helpful. Okay, so anyway, I probably got away from your question.
That's helpful. So the idea is just to get my mind around an image that I can have as a house with rooms in it.
Yeah.
So compartments.
Yeah, and we can only imagine that within the different rooms there's a being who can only see 3 inches away, or maybe even see half an inch. And the room may be thousands, 100,000 long. So he can only see a little distance away. That's his horizon. So he doesn't know that there's not that there are other rooms. He doesn't know there are walls. He doesn't know there are walls. The region close to him.
Right, it's like an ant crawling on a wall in a basement, perhaps.
Yeah, and so
where he sees a little bit further ahead of him.
Right, and so, for example, in one room the temperature could be freezing. In another room the temperature could be extremely hot. In one room it could be filled with oxygen. In the other room it could be filled with, carbon monoxide or something. And he'll look around the little part of the room he sees and says, well, everything is oxygen here, and everything is at the same temperature, and everything is the same as every... He doesn't realize that in the other room things are vastly different. So that's maybe a good way to visualize it.
Dawkins says in his book, and I noticed that Sister Mary Helen has just posted her question. But while we're still in this area, I figure I'd read from you from Dawkins. So the key difference between the genuinely extravagant God hypothesis and the apparently extravagant multiverse hypothesis is one of statistical improbability. The multiverse, for all that it is extravagant, is simple. God or any intelligent decision-taking, calculating agent would have to be highly improbable in the very same statistical sense as the entities he is supposed to explain.
The problem there, as for example, the excellent book by Thomas Nagel. I don't know if you guys have read that book. Thomas Nagel is an atheist and a very eminent philosopher, and he came out recently with a very short book whose title escapes me, but it's the most recent book by Thomas Nagel. And he pointed out the absurdity of that kind of argument. And it's that Dawkins doesn't understand the traditional Catholic conception of God. He thinks that a mind has to be the product of a brain, a very complicated brain. It's true, our minds are associated with extremely complicated brains. And presumably a brain that's more complicated can be more intelligent. But the traditional conception is that God is a perfectly simple being, without parts. He's not a complicated brain. He's not a complicated contraption. He has no parts. He's utterly simple. And so, if he understood that, if Dawkins understood that, if one understands that, his whole argument falls apart.
Right. Dawkins sees God as a highly complex, highly evolved being.
Well, that's the Catholic God. That's not the Christian God. That's certainly not the Christian.
Right.
So it's irrelevant. I mean, yes, I think he's right. If God is a very complicated being, then his argument is very strong. Now, he could say, okay, but how could you have a mind that's perfectly simple? And so then would have to explain to him how God can be perfectly simple. I mean, so he might have another argument that the mind has to be complicated. But if he's just assuming that as his argument is irrelevant to what we believe is Catholic. In my book, I do some discussion of the simplicity of God and how one can think about that. Anyway, Dawkins is assuming many of his conclusions.
Right. Yeah, he ends this thought with, the multiverse may seem extravagant in sheer number of universes, but if each one of those universes is simple in its fundamental laws, we're still not postulating anything highly improbable. So the multiverse is simple, but the very opposite has to be said of any kind of intelligence. Any kind of intelligence has to be complex.
That's what he's assuming. He's assuming that intelligence has to be complex. And I think one can make a strong case that that's not true. I try to make a case like that in one part of my book. But in any event, if he's arguing against complicated gods, then I agree with him. I don't believe in a complicated God, and I don't believe in a complicated God for the same reasons that Dawkins doesn't believe it. So
So he's really an atheist against the straw man God that he's created for himself.
Well, yeah, and of course, but he obviously can't conceive. You know, St. Augustine had problems analogous because at a certain stage in his life he thought that God had to be a material body because he was under the influence of various philosophies according to which things had to be material. And so he had a hard time with, because he was handicapped by this inadequate. And then the Platonists, by studying the Platonists, he realized that God didn't have to be a material body, but could be a mind, could be something spiritual. So, yeah, I think a lot of the problem is that people have an inadequate conception of God.
Mind and Cosmos, why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false.
Right, and the subtitle's a bit misleading. The book is not an attack on evolution in any way. By the way, I believe in evolution, and I think Catholics should stay away from anti-evolutionism. But so the subtitle's misleading. It's really an attack. Nagel's book, the title of which you just quoted, is an attack on scientific materialism, on the idea that everything that exists is reducible to physics, is reducible to the material, to the physical. And I think it's a powerful attack on that. And even though Nagel's an atheist, he's taken a lot of flack from people who don't like his book, from his fellow atheists who think he is selling out. So anyway, I heartily recommend that book. It's short, readable, powerful case made by an atheist against the kind of simple-minded materialism represented by people like Dawkins.
I read Sister Mary Helen's question. She wrote, Dr. Barr wrote an article on the First Things website with a helpful critique of ID argumentation. Mm-hmm. What helps him walk that line of arguing for the design factor of the anthropic coincidences without falling into ID argumentation? Okay. And in parentheses, she says, I'm not a fan of ID.
Okay. I would say that I think the most ancient design argument, that is the one that goes back to I think even the Old Testament to early Christian writings, is based on the very fact that the universe is orderly and lawful. The mistake the ID people make, I think, tactically speaking. By the way, I don't dismiss their idea out of hand. That is, it's quite possible. Their argument is that the way we recognize that there's an intelligent designer of the cosmos is by looking for things that are so complicated, like the human brain or like the blood clotting system, biological structures that show an enormous amount of complexity, and say those are too complicated to have arisen naturally by blind physical processes. Therefore, God had to step in. They won't use the word supernaturally. They won't say miraculously, but that's essentially what they're saying. That God had to step in and miraculously produce these complicated structures. So they're saying that these structures are things that natural explanations can't account for. But I don't think the older and wiser and more powerful kind of design argument was based on things that cannot naturally be explained. They were not based on sort of quasi-miraculous phenomena that for one reason or another fall outside of the ordinary course of nature. They were actually based on nature itself. It was nature that pointed to a cosmic designer, not things that were sort of so extraordinary that they couldn't be fully natural. So the early Christian writers, it was the orderliness and lawfulness of nature that pointed to a designer. It pointed to a lawgiver. Now, we may be wrong about the specific form of the laws of physics. That is, we have current theories of physics, and they may be inadequate. That almost certainly are. That is, later we're going to find theories that are deeper and more satisfactory. But one thing is clear. The laws of physics are of enormous mathematical subtlety, intricacy. They're very mathematically sophisticated. And so the orderliness of nature, as understood by the contemporary physicists, the orderliness of the universe is much greater than was apparent, say, 2,000 years ago to people. As more science discovers, the more orderliness, the more order we find in nature, and the more sophisticated and impressive that order, not less. And this is actually a whole part of my book, which I recommend people to read. Science does not explain away the orderliness of nature. It presupposes it. And whenever science explains, or physics anyway, explains some orderly feature of the universe, it always ends up explaining it by pointing to some deeper, more orderly, to a greater order at a deeper level. So just take a few examples. One example. Kepler discovered that the planets in the solar system trace out very beautiful mathematical patterns, ellipses, and so he found this beautiful order in the solar system that are called Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion. Newton later explained those orderly patterns, but he didn't explain it away. He actually explained Kepler's laws by deriving them from Newton's laws. And Newton's laws are more beautiful than Kepler's. Newton's laws show the universe a greater orderliness than Kepler had seen. Newton's laws of gravity are now understood to be a consequence of yet deeper laws, Einstein's theory of gravity. Einstein's theory of gravity reveals to us an even more impressive and deeper order than Newton's laws did. And the superstrings, as many people believe, are actually what explains Einstein's law of gravity. Superstring theory has a kind of mathematical orderliness that puts Einstein's theory of gravity in the shade. So the deeper we go from Kepler to Newton to Einstein to superstring theory, we see more and more impressive order the deeper we go. And so that's why I think the old design argument that said, look how orderly and lawful the universe is, there must be one who imposed order, there must be a lawgiver. That argument is strengthened the more we learn in science. It gets stronger and stronger the more we learn. The argument's based not on nature, but on sort of things that seem to go against nature, that violate natural law, that involve some sort of a departure from the order of nature, a miracle. That kind of argument, which the ID people make, is very vulnerable. Because if they say, here, this particular biological phenomenon cannot be explained naturally, they're very vulnerable, because 10 years from now we may explain it naturally, and poof, there goes their argument. Not only does that argument go, but it actually backfires on them. Because it makes people say, your reasons for believing in God are all being shown up as time goes on. And so it actually brings discredit upon religion. So that's what I think the big difference is. Are we looking for evidence of God in nature, in the natural order itself and its orderliness, or are we looking for God in departures from the natural order, which I think is a very risky strategy. Anyway, that's, I guess, period at the end of that.
Sister, did you have a follow-up question or comment? I see you shaking your head. I see you typing. Okay, good. Hold on a second.
Well, she's typing on...
And then Rhonda, you're...
She's typing on...
Rhonda.
Oh, you want me to... Okay, what else you say?
Oh, she said, I sent it to Dr. Barr. All good.
Here,
she wrote, I just agree that the point is to go back to Aquinas' true design argument.
I would like to know, when I teach like philosophy of God, which I also teach sometimes,
right.
I generally just go through the 5 ways, and I don't get into science in relation to it, okay? But then people say, oh, well, scientists wouldn't agree with these 5 ways. I do it by means of metaphysics. I studied metaphysics with Father Norris Clark, S.J., years and years ago.
Right.
So I just do it by metaphysics, but I want to ask you, do you think any of the 5 ways shouldn't be used because, in fact, you know, scientists would be right to say that argument is outmoded?
I'd have to go and look at the 5 ways again, and my own. No, I'm not sure. I would say certain of them I think should be used, and I have to go back and try to remember all 5 to know if there's any of the 5 that I would stay away from when talking to scientists. I'd have to punt on that. I would say the argument, the ones that I think, instead of referring to Aquinas' 5 ways, I guess the ones that I would use with an atheist, I would point to 2 things. One is the mere fact that the universe exists. I wouldn't base this on the fact that the universe is real. God, we need something to explain why, of all the possible universes that physicists dream up, only this one, presumably, or very few physicists would say that all mathematically possible universes actually exist somewhere. They wouldn't believe that. They would believe that there's only one universe, or maybe some number of universes, but not all possible ones exist. And so why does this universe exist and other ones that you might be able to dream up theoretically don't exist? Why is this universe real? Why does anything? The question is, why does anything exist at all? You know, the old question: why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there any real universe? That's something science cannot explain. In fact, there's a famous quote from Hawking when he was thinking a little more clearly about these things. And what he said was, and it's in his first book, The Brief History of Time. He said, all that physics can give you is a set of rules and equations. All that a physics theory is a set of mathematical rules and equations. Such a theory cannot explain why there's an actual real universe for those rules and equations to describe. It's the existence of the universe that's a mystery. It's reality. And that, I think, you need to have an ultimate cause for its being. The other thing I would point to, again, is the orderliness of nature. Presupposed by science, not explained by. Why is there this magnificent mathematical order? That would appeal, I think, to a scientist. One of my favorite quotes is from an early Christian writer, Minucius Felix. He wrote around 200 A.D. And one of the passages in his writings goes like this. I'm quoting from memory, but it's almost verbatim. He said, he's arguing with pagans for the existence of God. He says, if upon entering some home, you saw that everything there was well tended, neat, and decorative, you would believe that some master was in charge of those it, and was superior to those good things. So too, in the home of this world, when you see providence, order, and law in the heaven and on earth, know that there is a Lord and author of the universe, more beautiful than the stars themselves. And it goes on from there. In other words, what the physicist of the 20th century, 21st century sees more clearly than the layman is this fantastic, deep mathematical structure to the world. The mathematics takes the so-called standard model of particle physics, which is our current, and Einstein's theory of gravity. Those are the 2 pieces of our current theory of physics. Einstein's theory of gravity and the standard model of particle physics. The mathematics of those 2 theories are very sophisticated. One has to study mathematics in college for several years and study physics, for 5, 6, depends how smart you are, but say most people 5, 6, 7 years who go into theoretical physics just to understand the mathematical structure of these theories. That's how deep they are. That's how sophisticated the ideas upon which the universe is constructed. So how can the universe be based on such deep mathematical ideas without there being a mind behind it? And superstring theory is even more deep mathematically. Superstring theory has been intensively studied now since 1984. Actually, it's been studied since the early 70s, but intensively since 1984 by hundreds of the most brilliant people in the world. And they still haven't fully understood the mathematical structure of that theory. That's how deep the ideas are. How does such a sophisticated mathematical structure as our universe arise without some mind? So that's why I think the old argument, just from the lawfulness and orderliness of the world, is very powerful. And I think even some atheists would admit that they could believe in a God who is some sort of a super mathematician. The thing that makes many atheists, even Weinberg admitted in one of his books that the idea of God as this sort of mathematical mind was not absurd. And Einstein sort of believed in that kind of God. The kind of God they have a hard time believing in is a personal God who does miracles and so on, answers prayers and so on. But a God, they have difficulty with that. But a God who is sort of a super intelligence who designed the laws of physics and the universe, I think has some resonance with them. So that's a very good argument. And as I said, just the argument from the mere reality of the world, its existence, is another.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, what I'm going to do is when I teach the argument of the fifth way, I'm going to just refer them to your book. And so this is very helpful, very, very helpful. Now, here's a Catholic thing I want to ask you directly. Has Dawkins read your books? And if not, if you send him one and all of us big prayer warriors here do penance on our knees and flagellate ourselves, you think he would read the book?
I don't think it would make an impression because I think, well, not only, well, the prayer might take care of the grace that he needs, but I think that in many cases, many atheists, what is lacking is a will to understand. I mean, it's not just an intellectual failure; it's in the will. They don't want to believe in God. Even Nagel, who is actually, his book is a wonderful book and actually is a very powerful argument in many against a certain kind of atheism. He says he doesn't believe in God and he doesn't want to believe in God, he says. He doesn't want to believe in God. He doesn't want the world to be that way. And I think Dawkins, I think you could present him with the most powerful arguments and it wouldn't dent him, it wouldn't make a dent in him. It's a question of how open they are to the truth. Now, I can say this. I know that there's one physicist who, not many scientists have read my book, probably. I didn't do a good enough job of advertising it in the scientific world. But I did have one very gratifying encounter. There's a Nobel Prize winner in my field named Frank Wilczek. And I've known him since I was in graduate school, because I was a graduate student at Princeton, and at that time he was a professor at Princeton. And so he took an interest in me ever since I was a student. And so he came up to me, and he's a lapsed Catholic. He was raised a Catholic. I learned about this later. He was raised Catholic and left and abandoned and became an atheist when he was a teenager. He was reading books in Russell. So he came up to me at a physics conference about 3 or 4 years ago, and he said, "I've read your book." And I kind of braced myself, and he said, "I don't necessarily agree with all your conclusions, but it was very well done and deserves to be much better known." And I think the arguments in my book actually made a serious impression. It didn't bring him back to believe in God, but I think he now has a greater respect for belief in God and belief in the soul than he did before he read my book. But you see, though a lapsed Catholic, I don't think he's one of these bitter ex-Catholics. He's not. He's actually said in something he wrote that he wishes he could still believe in God. Whereas Dawkins, I think, is so filled with contempt for the whole idea. That I think he's simply not open to the truth at this point. We'll check, I think my book might be effective on somebody who has some desire to believe, some openness, but not a Dawkins. By the way, I have a whole long part of my book on anthropic stuff, on the multiverse, though I don't call it that in the book. I have an argument for the existence of God based on the design that we see in the laws of physics. That's a whole part of the book. And as far as God as the first cause, I have an appendix that explains some of that to the non-theologian. So Appendix A of the book talks about some of the classic arguments for God as the cause of being of the universe. So there's a lot of stuff in there. I think if I had to, I think my book is one of the few out there that is written. One of the groups I was writing it for were my fellow scientists, those of my fellow scientists who were atheists and who didn't understand why somebody could believe in God. That was one of my prime audiences. And so I think my book is actually, if you know someone who is an atheist and is scientifically inclined, but is open to persuasion or open to the truth, I think my book would actually be very helpful to them.
I think this would be very helpful.
Have you read all of my book or just parts of it? It's been somewhat product tested in the following way. There's a fellow down in New Orleans, a theologian friend of mine who teaches at the seminary down there, and he's had for the last 3 summers a 1-week program for Catholic high school teachers on science and religion. And half of the teachers have been science teachers and half of them have been religion teachers. And he assigns them about half a dozen or maybe 8 books to read, and then there's a week-long meeting where we sit around and discuss the books. And he tells me that my book is one of the ones that he assigns every year, and he says that he gets a lot of positive feedback from these teachers, that many of them say it's their favorite book that they were assigned. So those are people. And the other piece of feedback is that I get emails from time to time, mostly from scientists who are religious, who say they greatly appreciate my book, and they say this is just exactly the kind of book that I was looking for, And so I had so for example, I had an email from a biology professor at University of Iowa, and he was a recent convert to the Catholic faith from Judaism, Josh Weiner, and so he's now a good friend of mine. But I first met him when he sent me an email saying, I just read your book. I'm a recent convert to the faith, he said, and he said, your book is exactly the kind of book I was looking for. So this is a scientist writing this. So I think that my book is aimed, as I said, it was aimed at 2 audiences. It was aimed at my professional colleagues who might not understand what religion is, but it was also aimed at people who don't know any science. So it was aimed at the religious person who doesn't know much about science, but also at the professional scientist who doesn't understand much about religion. And I've gotten feedback from both groups saying that they liked it. So.
Well, besides all the brilliant things you said today, I must say I'm a person who feels as if I can't understand science, and I actually understood you. And so I'm very grateful.
There's only one equation in my book, and I only put that in for show. That's another thing. There's no equation.
Very clearly that we are not fideists, and we have faith in reason Catholics who are very happy to hear that we could be wrong about ID, or we could be wrong about multiple universes because we haven't researched it. So this very dialogue is a refutation of Dawkins.
Right, and we're not fideists, and one of the things I should say about Dawkins, and maybe this is uncharitable, but Dawkins has a superficial understanding of science. That is, but there's an article that people in the class might be interested in, and it's in First Things. I wrote it about 2 or 3 years ago. It's called Fearful Symmetry, or Fearful Symmetries, I forget which. And I explained why some biologists, like Dawkins, have a sort of, they have an incomplete perspective on modern science that sort of leads them into atheism. And their perspective is one where you start off with a kind of chaos in which orders gradually, the universe kind of self-assembles itself from chaos, and so you talk about the primordial soup, or some kind of primordial slime out of which the first living things formed. And then, or the galaxies and the stars and the planets formed from some primordial clouds of dust and gas. And that's true. If you look at sort of the history of how sort of tangible structures emerged in the history of the universe, you start off with sort of formless, amorphous stuff, and then you get, atoms, and then you get cells, and then you get multicellular organisms, and then you get, brains and so on, and nervous systems, and then you get the human brain, and you get more and more complexity and structure. But that's so you start with chaos and you end up with form, and that's misleading. Because if you look down at that from the physicist's point of view, look at that primordial soup, look at that slime or the gas and dust. The deeper you look into that primordial soup was made of atoms, and those atoms themselves have intricate structure. And the deeper you look into the structure of the physical world, the more order and structure you see. That's the physicist's perspective. As the deeper you go, you see more and more sublime and impressive order. Dawkins doesn't know any physics. He really doesn't. He knows very little physics. He's looking at just living things. And with living things, it works the way he says. You start with kind of formless stuff and you build up ever more intricate structures. But with physics, it works the opposite way. You start at the deepest level of the physical world with very intricate structure, out of which everything, ultimately flowers and unfolds. But you start, even at the Big Bang, the deep laws of physics that govern the universe from the time of the Big Bang onwards have very deep and intricate mathematical structure in there. It's not some formless slime. We did not emerge from some formless stuff. Okay? And so anyway, I have a whole article maybe saying that better than I can say it now, but it might be. All righty, maybe I should say good night to everyone and how much I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.